Change management is one of the most misunderstood disciplines within the world of digital transformation. It's also one that's full of misconceptions. What exactly are those misconceptions that you should be aware of when it comes to change management? That's what I want to talk about today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And in the years that I've been doing change management, one thing that's continued to fascinate me is the fact that it's misunderstood. It's a discipline that is not only underestimated, but it's also one that doesn't get the attention it deserves. And when it does get the attention it deserves, there's a number of misunderstandings or misconceptions or myths that people don't seem to understand about change management. So what I want to do today is talk about the 5 things that you should be aware of and the 5 most common misconceptions as it relates to change management. And for more information about some of these misconceptions and to learn more best practices about change management, I encourage you to download my ebook called A Guide to Organizational Change Management. In this ebook, you can download with the QR code in front of you or the links below. This guide will explain to you all the different best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management for your digital transformation. So I encourage you to check out that resource in addition to this video. One of the first common misconceptions about organizational change management is that employees won't resist change. And this is a really easy one to fall into, especially if you're a leader or a manager within an organization. And the reason that this is such a common pitfall is because on the surface, most people within most organizations support change. They want change. They recognize the need for change. They recognize the need for better processes and tools and technologies to help them do their jobs more effectively. So when organizations first introduced the idea of digital transformation or ERP implementations or whatever technology initiative you might be going through, most employees generally get it. They generally are excited about the opportunity, and they generally are not going to flat out resist the change. However, change resistance typically lies below the surface, and it's very powerful, and it's very subtle, and it's hard to see. And the reason that it's subtle and below the surface is not because employees are intentionally hiding it from you or hiding it from us as leaders, but because people don't fully understand what the changes are early in a project. And early in the project, while they're excited about it, they don't fully understand what it's going to mean to them and how it's going to impact their job. So as a project evolves and as the future state becomes more evident and more apparent and more clearly defined, that's when employees within organizations start to push back on the change because they feel threatened by it. For example, on the surface, an employee might fully understand and acknowledge the need to improve their tools and processes, but then once they start to get into the details of how their spreadsheet or their process or their heroics and their tribal knowledge is now going to be automated, that's where you start to feel the threat of the change. And that's when people will start to subtly push back on the change, start to question the change, and suddenly they're not as excited about the change as they might have been early in the project. So the first thing to recognize is that resistance to change is going to happen. It's not a matter of if it's going to happen, but it's when is it going to happen and how severe is it and what is the root cause of the resistance to change. That's the key question to ask yourself. And understanding those root causes and getting to a point where you can mitigate those sources of resistance is something that's very important and one of the first steps you should take as part of an organizational readiness strategy. A second common misconception within the discipline of change management is that training is really the focal point or the center of a change management strategy. This is simply not true. Now, training is very important, don't get me wrong. It's an important capstone to an organizational change strategy. But it's just that, it's a capstone. It's something that comes later in a project. It's something that's more of a formality and more of a way to finish off your organizational strategies and tactics. Leading up to the training is all the real change management work. It's all the stuff that's really the heavy lifting behind organizational change management. So things like the organizational assessments, the change impact analysis, the organizational design, really understanding what the impacts are to the organization and how people will likely react to that change, and really helping them through that change. All that stuff that I just described is stuff that needs to happen prior to end user training. If you wait until end user training to spring a bunch of these changes onto your employee base, they will definitely freak out and they will panic. And you don't want them to freak out and panic at that point in the project. You want them to freak out and panic earlier in the project. Now, of course, we hope that they won't freak out and panic. We want to ensure that they embrace the change and that they're on board with it. And that's the whole point of a change management strategy, is to ensure that we understand and empathize with people and get to the root cause of what drives them and makes them tick, so that we can ultimately focus on training people to do their jobs when we get to end user training, and not use training as really the focal point or the centerpiece of our change management strategy. So that's another misconception to keep in mind, is that change management goes well beyond training. In fact, an overwhelming majority of what makes change initiatives successful has nothing to do with how well you do training. You do need to do the training well, but it's the other stuff leading up to training that ultimately determines whether or not your project is successful. Another common change management misconception, which is actually more of just an oversight than anything, is the fact that most organizations don't recognize or realize when they are not internally aligned. In other words, they're internally misaligned as an organization, and that becomes the root cause of why the digital transformation struggles or ultimately fails. And so one thing that organizations need to do is recognize that there's a high degree of probability that they're not fully aligned, and they need to get aligned before they get too far into their project. What often ends up happening is organizations, leadership, and the project teams don't recognize and feel the fact that they're misaligned until they get well into the digital transformation. When they wait that long to recognize that they're not misaligned, what happens is that misalignment trickles down throughout the organization, and people start to resist change even more. And by the time you try to remediate and correct some of those areas of misalignment, you either end up spending a lot more time and money on the project than you would have if you were just aligned from the beginning, or worse yet, you end up rushing the project and just trying to power through that misalignment, which usually doesn't end well. So one of the biggest things you can do as an organization is, first of all, assess how well aligned you are. And secondly, you want to recognize that you're probably not 100% aligned, and that's okay. No organization is, and the bigger and more global and more complex and more diverse you are as an organization, the more likely that that statement is true. But the key here is we want to recognize and measure where we're misaligned and start to identify how we can get aligned. Just to give you an example of what I mean by alignment is something as simple as what this digital transformation means to us as an organization. How will this digital transformation improve our business? Pretty simple question. Many of you watching right now might be able to rattle off a few ideas that is consistent across your organization, but there's also probably going to be nuances and details that are different among different people within your organization. So it's really important that you ensure that you get that sort of alignment internally and make those key decisions and have that clarity of vision with your project early on. And ultimately, this all starts at the top. It starts with your executive team, with the executive setting the tone and the vision and the direction for the digital transformation. And ultimately, that alignment at the executive level needs to push down throughout the rest of the organization. And one last thing I'll throw out there is that this is especially true in today's day and age of agile deployments. Agile is becoming a very in vogue word, where a lot of digital transformations are focused on speed and getting immediate business value out of their transformation initiatives. Good intentions, of course, but what that often does is it leads to speed at the expense of misalignment, which creates problems later on in a project. Many organizations and change teams that we work with view change management as a specialization. They view it as a discipline that is a specialization, something that a separate team that's focused on change management is going to focus on. Now, of course, every project needs to have some degree of specialization. You need to have different people that specialize in project management, the business analysis, the technical components of your change, as well as change management itself. Now, one of the problems with organizational change management is that a lot of people don't understand it, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and so they therefore want to bring in the experts to just handle it for them. But the other problem with change management, the even bigger problem, is that change is something that needs to be led by executives within an organization. Yes, you need people that can bring methodologies and tools and capabilities to help enable the changes, but ultimately it's the people that are the face of the change that need to drive and lead that change. So your executive team, your project leadership, those are some of the people that you want to ensure are actually leading the change. And so you don't want to separate change management too much from the overall transformation. We at my company, Third Stage Consulting, recently had a client that helped us coin the phrase Trojan horse change management. And the reason we coined this phrase is because this organization really didn't like the idea of having a standalone change management team. They viewed it as the responsibility of the leadership team, which is a very astute observation on their part. And the reason I really like this idea is because they didn't want to use the term change management. They didn't want to create any sort of change management initiatives. They just wanted it to be baked into the DNA of how they do business and how they led the transformation. And it proved to be a very effective way of doing the overall transformation. They used us to provide the methodologies, the tool sets, and do a lot of the behind the scenes change management activities. But ultimately, the leadership and the overall employees within this client team were the ones who were leading the change, and they were the faces of change management. And it turned out to be very effective for that reason. So one thing you can do to avoid this problem is to ensure that you view change management as a sort of Trojan horse. You want to address change management, but really bake it and integrate it with everything you do as a leadership team, as well as how you deliver the project as well. Now, the last major misconception that I'll talk about here today as it relates to change management is when people view change management as a nice to have. It's something that we'll do if we have the time, if we have the budget, if we have the resources. Sure, we'll try to get to it. And rather than viewing it as a nice to have, it's critical that organizations view organizational change management as an absolute necessity. And knowing that time and resources and budget are all limited, it forces us into some pretty difficult decisions. We can't boil the ocean. We can't do everything we would like to do in a perfect world. That's just the reality of organizational life. However, we can make prioritized decisions around the most important parts of our transformation. And rather than focusing too much time and effort on the technology, for example, you'd be better served to focus on the organizational change and the people aspect of change. In our company's history of helping hundreds of organizations throughout the world through their digital transformation over the last 5 years, we found that the organizations that are the most successful are the ones that might invest a little bit less in technology than they'd like, but they really double down on the change management. So while the scope of technology might be smaller than they'd like, they really handle the people component of change really well, and that ends up serving them very well. So you have to ask yourself, would you rather have more technology that isn't deployed well, or might you have less technology that's deployed really well and actually used by your employees to drive business value throughout your organization? So it's important to not fall into the trap of thinking that change management is a nice to have, because it is an absolute necessity. Without it, there really is no path to success within your digital transformation. So I hope this has provided you some guidance and some things to think about and some pitfalls to avoid and some misconceptions to avoid as it relates to digital transformations and change management within digital transformations. For more information and more best practices around change management, I encourage you to download and read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a lengthy white paper that talks about different best practices and lessons learned as it relates to organizational change management. You can read that by scanning the QR code in front of you, or you can go to the links that I've included in the description field below. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day. Within the world of digital transformation. Yep. All right. Rough start. Disciplines within the world of change management.
No way.
Nope. It's not what I meant to say at all. But what exactly? No. Hold on. Bear with me. Yeah, I know. There are also a number of misconceptions about digital. No. Change management is also one of.
Oh my goodness.
Wow, this is probably
this one might win like
the worst start ever.
Yeah, you did it.
I did it. Yay.
Well done.
Only 1,000 more mistakes to make in this video.
That's all right.